The new rear suspension introduced by Ferrari at the Belgian Grand Prix represented the Italian team's last major technical upgrade so far, an update that dates back 7 Grands Prix ago. Since that race weekend at Spa-Francorchamps, both Mercedes and in particular Red Bull have continued to bring a steady flow of developments, gradually surpassing the Scuderia in overall competitiveness and consistency. When compared directly with McLaren, however, Ferrari's SF-25 single-seater has demonstrated a modest yet noticeable recovery in terms of performance and lap time potential, thanks largely to the reworked rear-end configuration. This evolution, however, has not come without a few drawbacks and side effects, some of which seem to have specifically impacted Charles Leclerc more than his teammate. During the United States Grand Prix weekend at the Circuit of the Americas in Austin, Charles Leclerc made several interesting comments that caught the attention of fans and analysts alike. In particular, he spoke about the adjustments made to his Ferrari before the qualifying session. The Monegasque driver explained in an interview with Sky Sport F1 that he hadn't completely revolutionized the car, but that he and the team had made several small adjustments in different areas, particularly involving a new element he had tested that day, which he felt had helped him better align the car with his driving style. Throughout the sprint race weekend, Charles Leclerc used the shorter format as an opportunity to experiment extensively with the settings on his steering wheel. These likely involved fine-tuning parameters such as brake balance, brake migration, differential mapping, and power delivery modes. All of these play an essential role in the driver's control of the car's behavior, in braking, cornering, and traction phases. Among these parameters, the differential adjustments are perhaps the most significant and technically impactful. The differential can be calibrated independently for different phases of the corner, entry, mid-corner, and exit, allowing the driver to modify the way torque is distributed between the two driven rear wheels. By slightly opening or tightening the differential, the car alters the proportion of power transferred to each wheel, creating a small but meaningful imbalance in the forces between the inner and outer sides of the car. This dynamic difference directly influences how the car behaves mid-corner. It can either make the rear end more prone to rotation, resulting in oversteer, or more stable and planted, producing understeer. Such fine-tuning enables the driver to personalize the car's responsiveness and balance, depending on whether they are on the brakes, coasting, or applying throttle. These ongoing experiments from Charles Leclerc clearly show his intent to adapt the updated SF-25 package to his personal driving style. The Ferrari driver himself confirmed this approach when he admitted that for several races, he had struggled to extract performance from the new specification. After Saturday's sessions in Austin, he stated that he had been struggling for several races to adapt to the car with its new components, but that he believed he had finally discovered something that improved his feeling and confidence behind the wheel. The reference was to the rear suspension that Ferrari first introduced at Spa, which was the Maranello team's most recent major upgrade, and may have altered the car's handling characteristics in ways that didn't fully suit Charles Leclerc's driving preferences. In contrast, Lewis Hamilton has not publicly reported any particular difficulties since Ferrari introduced the new suspension package. Quite the opposite, in fact. The British 7-time world champion has often expressed that he finally feels at one with the SF-25, a feeling reflected in his increasingly competitive pace relative to his teammate. Lewis Hamilton has focused on refining several aspects of the car's operation, including the adoption of new rear brake pads that have been in use since the Belgian Grand Prix. These components have contributed to improving braking consistency and pedal feel, which in turn help build driver confidence over a race distance. However, it is reasonable to wonder whether Hamilton's growing confidence and Charles Leclerc's difficulties could both be linked to the changes in the car's suspension behavior and balance. Both Ferrari drivers share an aggressive approach to braking, typically maximizing the potential of the front axle and trail braking deep into corners. However, the Monegasque tends to favor a more agile car with a front-end bias, allowing him to rotate the car quickly on corner entry, even at the expense of some rear-end stability. Earlier in the season, before the summer break, Lewis Hamilton had occasionally opted to run with a higher downforce rear wing than his teammate. This was intended to provide additional stability to the rear end, a choice that highlighted differences in setup philosophy between the two Ferrari drivers. Interestingly, since the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort, this trend has reversed. The British driver has not required the extra downforce to stabilize the car, suggesting that the new suspension has inherently provided greater rear-end confidence. At the Singapore Grand Prix, Lewis Hamilton briefly returned to a higher downforce setup during free practice, testing different aerodynamic balances, but later reverted to a more neutral configuration. At the Azerbaijan Grand Prix in Baku, he even mirrored Charles Leclerc's low-drag setup by running a lighter rear wing configuration, confirming the new suspension's stabilizing effect. The prevailing theory within the Ferrari camp is that the updated rear suspension has improved the car's stability under braking and acceleration, providing Lewis Hamilton with greater confidence and predictability. However, the same change has likely made it more difficult for Charles Leclerc to rotate the car as sharply as before, limiting his ability to exploit his natural driving style. This situation appears to have had an effect on the overall drivability of the SF-25, effectively narrowing its setup window, meaning the car is now more sensitive to small changes in configuration. This has been evident in the team's difficulty in finding consistent balance across various race weekends, as seen in their setup reversions at Zandvoort, Baku, Singapore, and Austin. Nonetheless, Ferrari's technical data indicates that the new suspension has allowed the engineers to achieve a small but measurable aerodynamic gain, enabling the car to run slightly closer to the ground by a few millimeters. This adjustment helps increase downforce and efficiency. However, despite this progress, the system has not completely resolved Ferrari's ongoing challenges with maintaining optimal ride height, a persistent issue that even forced the team to raise the car again after Friday's free practice sessions in Singapore. It remains quite difficult to measure with absolute precision the overall impact of Ferrari's updated suspension since its debut at Spa. This is largely due to the fact that Red Bull and Mercedes have continued to roll out new developments and aerodynamic refinements, constantly shifting the performance order. As a result, McLaren has become the most reliable benchmark for comparison, since their last major technical update remains the new floor they introduced at the Belgian Grand Prix. According to available data, the figures suggest a modest yet encouraging improvement for Ferrari. The average qualifying gap between Ferrari and McLaren decreased from approximately 0.46%, measured across the 8 qualifying sessions between Miami and Silverstone, to 0.38% over the 9 qualifying sessions contested with the new rear suspension. This represents a small but meaningful step forward in relative performance terms. It is also worth noting that in 3 of those 9 qualifying sessions, Ferrari managed to close the gap to McLaren to within 0.10%, a level of proximity that had not been achieved during the earlier phase of the season. These numbers underline that while the progress is not dramatic, the suspension change has contributed to measurable gains. It must be emphasized, however, that McLaren's recent difficulties in adapting to certain track characteristics slightly distort the comparison, as do the simultaneous updates that both teams introduced between the Austrian and British Grand Prix. Nevertheless, the SF-25 has not demonstrated any clear regression in performance relative to McLaren since the adoption of the new rear suspension. In fact, the Woking-based team also made progress with its upgraded floor introduced at Spa, meaning Ferrari's consistency in keeping pace is a positive sign. Although the suspension modification has arguably created additional setup challenges for Charles Leclerc, it seems to have produced genuine gains in absolute performance for Ferrari as a whole. The decline in Ferrari's results in the latter part of the season should therefore be attributed less to the effectiveness of the suspension update, and more to the strategic decision made by the Italian team to halt car development earlier than their rivals. Both Red Bull and Mercedes continued to evolve their packages deep into the campaign, ensuring ongoing aerodynamic and mechanical progress. Despite the encouraging signs, the performance gap to McLaren remains considerable. The data suggests that while Ferrari has slightly reduced the deficit, the SF-25 still trails the MCL-39 by a margin that keeps the Scuderia under growing pressure. Unless there is an unexpected breakthrough or a race weekend of extraordinary circumstances, Ferrari risks closing the season without securing a single race victory. A prospect that would be disappointing given the team's early season potential and the promise shown by the car's strong qualifying form earlier in the year.